Okay, guys, today we have on Ruslan from Extended, one of the more popular and exciting perp DEXs out there. I've had a number of perp DEXs on recently, so I thought I would continue the pattern. And it's obviously the talk of it's like one of the most popular narratives right now. So I thought I would get a number of views. Ruslan, welcome. You have some background connection with Revolut. What were you doing there? Yeah, just like a brief intro into maybe like how you came to start building.
Yes, and thanks a lot for inviting me, Guard. Happy to be here. As for the intro on my side, it's pretty simple, right? So we've been building Extended for 2 years now, I think, right? Before Extended, myself and most of my colleagues, right? Most of my team, we were at Revolut. I was the head of crypto operations there, essentially responsible for the P&L of the crypto department, responsible for the roadmap, for hiring, organizing the work, prioritizing it, right? Defining what we do, how we do, when, what we release, and essentially have spent also 2 years at Revolut doing that.
Got it. Okay, so 2 years now working on Extended. Explain like a very high level overview. Extended is a perp DEX. Is it an L2? Is it its own proper blockchain? Yeah, just like give me the rundown.
Yes. So with Extended, right, we have a vision to build unified margin across perps, vault, spot, and an integrated lending market, right? In parallel, we're also building the retail app, right? Because obviously the current product is more focused on the crypto native users, right? So let's call them pro users. And we're also working to release a native application, right? With embedded wallet creation, native wallet and off-ramps to essentially start attracting retail users into the space, right? As for the settlement logic, essentially the way it works is we're settling all the transactions on Starknet, right? Okay. There is an open source smart contract which anyone can view, right? As part of our settlement logic, we also have the on-chain validations of all the transactions that impact user balances, so trades, transfers, ADLs, liquidations, and effectively what we verify is that every transaction is essentially valid, right, and is in accordance with the rule of the exchange. Those rules basically are quite simple, right? So, for example, for trades, we verified that the execution price at which we settle is not worse than the price that the user has signed over, that as the result of the trade, both parties involved into that remain solvent, right? So essentially all that logic is open and publicly available. As for the Starknet itself, we also completely abstracted from the users, right? So you can connect to Extended with any EVM wallet. You can deposit, withdraw to a majority of the EVM chains, right? So essentially, we're using Starknet as the settlement layer, but from the user standpoint, you don't need to interact with it.
Yeah, I want to ask quickly, what do you think are the most important parts of verifiability or ability to, like you were just talking about the execution, like being able to verify the execution? What in your mind are, so the reason I ask this is because I've now talked to somebody from Ostium. I know the people from Ellipsis who responds to my podcast. I've talked to a guy who's building a centralized exchange called QFX. It's like a very exciting space right now. In your mind, like what are the critical components of a perp DEX that must be on chain in order for it, in your opinion, for it to be secure, trustless, whatever we're kind of optimizing for?
Yes. So I would say there are a couple of things, right? One, from just the security standpoint, right? All the funds should be self-custodial. The operator of the exchange, like us in this example, shouldn't have back the user funds, right? And a user should be able to access their funds in case the operator of the exchange is not available, right? So let's assume for some reason we as Extended team stop existing, right? The user should still be able to access their funds, right? That's one. The second thing is that the exchange has to always remain solvent. So basically the assets which the exchange has have to be above the liabilities, right? And I think that this has to be verified on chain, right? Basically the way we do it is that every single user transaction leads to the health check on all the involved accounts, right? And those accounts have to be solvent. And if individual accounts are solvent, then the entire exchange is solvent, right? So that's the second thing. And the third thing is everything which is related to the execution logic, right, of all the transactions which impact the user accounts again. So, for example, let's assume you're liquidating the user, right? That user has to be indeed liquidatable. So for example, again, the way we do it is that we on chain have the equity of the user and we have his maintenance margin requirements, both as defined based on the external mark prices, right? And if on chain the user is liquidatable, only at that point we can liquidate him off chain as well, right? Because otherwise, essentially that prevents us from randomly liquidating users, right? And the similar logic applies to all the other types of transactions, right? If we take an example of the trade, you sign over the order that you want to buy one BTC at the worst price of $100,000, right? We shouldn't be able to execute that order at the worst price that you signed over, right? And obviously there are much more examples, but basically that boils down to the execution of the trading logic.
Okay, so I know Extended has been running a points program for quite some time. What has been your experience and just kind of like, what have been your thoughts on kind of sourcing users and then liquidity in general, right? That's oftentimes kind of that's one of the like draws to Perp DEXs. Obviously, if there's deep liquidity. Yeah. Like, what has been your experience doing that, and like how do you kind of see the landscape?
Look, in my experience and in my opinion, both the flow / the users and the liquidity go hand in hand. Right. So essentially, if you have a growing retail user base, if you have the growing flow, right, the liquidity will come, right? And vice versa as well, right? If you have the best liquidity out there, you will get the users eventually, right, to trade on your platform. For us, effectively, we've been working on both, obviously attracting the retail users and improving the liquidity. So I think currently we have a relatively good position, right? Given that we have lower fees than, for example, Hyperliquid, right? That the total cost of execution on Extended is often lower, right? Than even on the major venues, right?
But so in the end, quickly, yeah. Like I was following, I think one of our friend who I guess works with you, Guard. I think he either retweeted or tweeted something that showed. So it's like this website. It's like almost a widget that you can look at the total cost of execution through a bunch of perp DEXs, right? And it's like quite interesting because Hyperliquid may have the best pricing on some, Extended may have best pricing on some. Then you see Lighter, and it kind of varies, right? It depends on liquidity. And then I think also what's factored in here is this idea that lower fees don't necessarily mean like overall less price paid for execution. How do you kind of determine this? So like when you say we have a cheaper execution cost, does that include the spread? Like how do you kind of break this down from somebody who's actually building one of these things versus us who have all this information?
We always think about it super simply, right? There are fees which we explicitly charge to the users. At Extended, they are reasonably low, right? So we have a 2.5 pips taker fee and the 0 maker fee. And obviously then there is a slippage which you bear at the execution of every trade. So when we measure the total cost of execution, basically we measure slippage across the pairs, across various clip sizes, across a certain period of time, and we add the fee that we charge on top of that, right? And indeed, right, zero fees don't always mean that you will have the lower total cost of execution. I mean, you can actually see it on Lighter, right, where on the major pairs, indeed, right, they have super tight liquidity and the total cost of execution on lower, right? On many altcoins, despite us charging a fee, we have a better total cost of execution just because our spreads are naturally tighter. Because effectively, when you charge the spread, right, when you charge the fee, you have the opportunity to pay maker rebates, right? If you are paying maker rebates, then the makers, they can actually quote tighter, right? And
so actually, just on a personal level, like this is a subject that comes up often on Twitter, and I've been following loosely this idea, and it's often in reference to like Hyperliquid and Lighter, right? So Lighter charges zero fees, and there's some argument, and I've had this discussion with other people, which is that when you charge zero fees, you end up having a lot of toxic flow, and you have a lot of takers kind of like picking off orders, and so that naturally widens spreads. The counterpoint is just that if you have a lot of retail trading, right, like a lot of retail trading, that ultimately you can charge zero fees. What is your thought on like zero fees in general? We've seen it with Robinhood, but I don't know if it's a direct comparable. I think people try to say it is. It's not really. What are your thoughts on like the idea of zero fees in general?
Look, there are a couple of thoughts on that, right? I would say that one, if you have a proper retail flow, right? They indeed don't really care about the spread, but you can also make the same argument that they don't really care about the fees, right?
Right.
Because basically, and I saw that working in Revolut, right? Back when I was there, I think we had approximately 10 million crypto users, right? And the Revolut fees were quite high, much higher than any other centralized exchange. And those users were still trading on Revolut, right? Because
Like
they didn't
Coinbase.
care that much about the fees. Exactly, right? And then obviously there was also a spread, right? But they didn't mention the total cost of execution because effectively if they are trading $1,000, they don't mind paying $10 indices, right? Because the price movements will have a much bigger impact on their trade than the actual fees, right? I would say that I agree with you that you cannot really draw a direct line comparing Robinhood to Lighter in a sense, because when you trade on a zero fee Perp DEX, you still see the liquidity, you still see the order book, right? Like the flow is very different. Also, the types of the users who currently trade there are very different, and they mentioned those spreads, right? But as we can see, at least so far, right, they still have reasonably high volume, right, reasonably high number of users, and all the other metrics, right? So it works for them as of now, right? I guess we'll see what will happen after a year TG, right? But for your first point regarding the fact that with zero fees you have much more toxic flow, yes, that's indeed the case, right? And the makers will be widening the spreads, right? Yeah, I do agree on that, right? Like with an example of Lighter, I think you need to have a pro account because otherwise you're rate limited, right? But still the outcome is the same.
Yeah, I think there's actually a paper from about 4 years ago that Binance did a promotion at one point for 3 to 6 months where I guess it was for some users, like maybe a large portion of users, it was functionally zero fees. And somebody kind of did a breakdown and showed that at first it looked quite good. And then over time, spreads did widen out. But I think it's a bit to be determined. And I don't have like such a great read as to whether or not it's, sustainable long run, but I think there can be different models, right? Like I wouldn't write off the 100%. Idea of zero fees, right? Yeah.
100%. There can definitely be different models, right? In the end, right? If we assume that we live in the perfect economy, right? The total cost of execution across the zero fee benches and the ones which charge the explicit fee should be more or less comparable, right?
Yeah.
They are just priced differently, right? From our standpoint, we just prefer the way of charging a transparent fee, right? Of transparently paying rebates to market makers, of having the same conditions for all the users. So everyone is subject to the speed bump on all the orders aside from the post only and cancels, right? Everyone pays the same fee. Everyone follows the same rebate schedule for the maker flow, right? And we believe that it is a very transparent and efficient model.
I wanted to ask you something, and this kind of applies to basically all Perp DEXs being built. So I'm not singling out Extended by any means here. The one of the kind of like big questions is, so Hyperliquid did an airdrop, and they've had they've done quite well post airdrop, right? There's still been a lot of traders. Now there's still some argument that a lot of that is kind of farming a second airdrop that's to be announced, or maybe it's not to be announced. But so Hyperliquid's one example, and then there's Lighter, which obviously is yet to, do an airdrop and is doing a points program. And then there's Pacifica and Extended and all of these others that are doing points programs. I'm kind of curious, like, how do you view being able to understand your product market fit, or just Perp DEXs in general? How do you try to gauge like how much of your user base is kind of long run sustainable versus, what is, and again, this applies to every single Perp DEX, including the ones that have already TGE'd. How much of this is, really like long run? We can point to these users and say, oh yeah, like these are sticky users and we have found product market fit, right? And I think that is hard, even outside of Perp DEXs as well, right? We've seen this with airdrop farming since the beginning. It's hard to determine. So I'm just kind of like curious about your overarching view on that.
Sure. Look, honestly, I think first, right, perps in general, right, are in a much better position than any other product in crypto, right? Because effectively perps do have the biggest product market fit across all the categories, right? So essentially, a lot of people, I think, compare the the existing narrative of the Perp DEXs with the L1, L2 narratives, which were like essentially popular a couple of years ago, right?
Right.
But with Perp DEXs, I would say the business model itself naturally is naturally more efficient, right?
Yeah.
Hence, I would say that the entire industry is in the better position, right, when compared to the other narratives. That's one. The second thing, given that perps in general do have the biggest product market fit in the space, right, regardless of whether these are centralized exchanges or decentralized exchanges, right, there is definitely a huge market out there, right, which is currently still mainly taken by the centralized exchanges, and the market share of the perp DEXs grows, right? But at the same time, when we just started building, right, Hyperliquid wasn't even live back then, right? This was 2 years ago. Essentially, the only two perp DEXs out there, okay, the most notable ones were DYDX and GEMX, right?
Yeah.
And I think in their best days, they accounted for 1 to 2% of the global perps trading volume, right? What we see now is that perp DEXs market share has increased to about 15 to 20%, right, depending on the day. And I do believe that this narrative and this trend will continue, right? Because effectively, perp DEXs are just safer for users to trade in the nutshell, right? One, they are safer. Secondly, they are more accessible, right? You don't need to go through the complex KYC process, right? If you build the perp DEX properly, you will not be able to freeze user funds, right? Yes, you can limit the access to the exchange itself, but the user will still have access to his funds, right? So if we fundamentally believe that the perps in general do have the product market fit, and if we believe that self-custody, right, and ease of access matters, then the perp DEXs as the market overall will succeed, right, in the long run. I do believe that one will see the growth of the perp market overall, right? Just as more people join crypto, right, they will naturally start trading perps at some point, right? And secondly, that we'll see a continuous growth of the market share of the perp DEXs in the overall, right? If both of those assumptions are true, right, then there's definitely a place for at least a couple of perp DEXs, right, with organic and natural flow in the long run, right?
Let me take a moment to talk to you about Ellipsis Labs, a team I've known for a while building some of the most interesting products in the space. The Ellipsis team is one of the few that I can consistently point to and say, these guys really know what they're doing. They're backed by Paradigm, Electric Capital, and Han Ventures. The founders, Eugene and Jerry, have experience at Citadel, Jane Street, and the Solana core team. Since launching their order book DEX, Phoenix, they've done over $80 billion in trading volume by making on-chain order books competitive with centralized exchanges. They are also the team behind Gavel and SolFi. I would consider them the foremost experts in crypto market microstructure. The best part is Ellipsis is hiring for New York-based engineers. Work with a small, focused team who are results-driven, collaborative, and use a modern stack. If you're an engineer who wants to work on infrastructure that's already proving itself in the market, go to ellipsislabs.xyz. Okay, now back to the show. You were talking before about you guys are working on an app, like sort of improving the user interface, because for the most part right now and this I suppose applies to all, at least most of the Perp DEX that I've interacted with, it does sort of gear more towards a sophisticated trader. What are your thoughts in terms of bridging that gap? I mean, the reason I ask is because, like, on one hand, I understand the desire to kind of create a much more accessible, like maybe easily interpretable interface for a new user. With that said, ironically, I find most Perp DEXs to have like a pretty similar look to them. And I personally, because I'm not really like a pro, I'm not like a, I'm not like a pro trader. They're all kind of interchangeable to me. And even also when I'm trading, like very rarely, only on a few altcoins have I ever been like, whoa, I get it now in terms of slippage. But if I'm trading Bitcoin or ETH, like I'm not going to, move the market a ton. So a lot of them do seem kind of almost like substitutable. So I'm curious, like in your mind, what do you think are the big unlocks that turn something from, mostly crypto natives who experience this stuff into something that like a retail user would find a lot more accessible? Like what are those like ideas in your
Yes.
in your head?
I think there can be a lot of the discussion on how the user interface should look like for the more retail type of the users, right? But I think what most of the people would agree is that there are two problems which you need to solve to start attracting retail, right? One is you need to have the embedded wallet creation when you create an account with the Perp DEX, and secondly, you need to be able to on-ramp and off-ramp funds to those accounts, right? Once those two obstacles are solved, right, and I think both ourselves and most of the other Perp DEXs, I think they will eventually solve both of those things, right? And it would become a standard for a Perp DEX to have a proper native mobile application with embedded wallet creation, right? With native on and off ramps, both for the cards and the bank transfers, right? The product itself at that stage can already be used by the retail, right? And then everything effectively will boil down to the go-to-market and to the ways those Perp DEXs reach their users, right? And essentially, obviously, everyone will have a slightly differentiated go-to-market, right? But I do believe that as the industry, right, in order for us to succeed, this is the direction we should be moving to going forward. Because currently what we have, I don't know, maybe 50,000 active Perp DEX traders, right, across all the exchanges, right? But the market there is much bigger than that. Like Revolut, for example, at my times there had 1 million, approximately 1 million of monthly active users on crypto only, right?
Yeah.
Probably by now it's a couple of million people, right?
What do you think about mobile trading? Is this like, you think this is important or no?
For retail, it is definitely important, right? Because most of the retail users, I mean, in reality, it's important for both, right? Even if you are a crypto native user who effectively, trades quite intensively, you will likely be trading from the web application, right? But you still want to be able to access your positions, your accounts with your mobile, right? As for the retail, they will mostly trade from mobile, right? So it is important.
Yeah, I've thought about that. I know there's like been a big push, and also there's some kind of, applications outside of these DEXs that are like specifically for mobile. Like I've seen this like Dexari and Liquid and stuff. And I don't know, it's probably the one thing that I've never, so I will say on 1010, I had like a few positions that I didn't have my phone, or I only had my phone, but it was going to be too complicated to try to close. And I do wish I had mobile access, but so those are like some, kind of like outlier scenarios, but for the most part, it's probably the one thing that I never really touch on my phone is perps. Like I always use web interfaces. Whereas like when we were trading, I say we, like my group of, friends who all of us losing money trading Solana meme coins, we were using like Telegram bots and stuff, right? But that seems like quite different than perps. Like I do kind of want to see, maybe I'm not like examining the order book, but I kind of want to see like a web interface. So, but maybe that changes for retail. Like I guess that's kind of your thought going forward.
Yes, but also the native mobile application doesn't have to be super simplified, right? You can have two versions of the native application. You can have a pro version and the retail version, right? Where in the pro version, you will have all the functionality you have on the web application, right? Just fit it into the mobile screen so that people who need all that data and all the information can still access it, right? Whereas for retail, you can have a lighter version of the application.
Kind of on that note, what do you think about either apps or just built in through wallets, like specific wallets, or like what you were talking about, mobile applications that aggregate different perp DEXs? Is this ever going to happen? It's kind of interesting, right? Because with Spot, like trading on Ethereum,
yes,
I now go to Llama Swap, like, right? DeFi Llama is like open source sort of unopinionated swap almost every time I'm, which isn't all that frequently, but when I'm trading, I almost always go there. And for Spot, that makes all the sense in the world, right? They route around any type of fees and it's real liquidity. It's not a derivative. Does this ever happen with perps? I've seen some people talking about this, that, you want to open a 10x long Bitcoin for 100K, and you get on, mobile or web app wallet, and it just routes you to wherever that's going to be executed at the best price. Do you think this is the future, or is there real liquidity moats? And also, trust and security assumptions, right, that differ across all these different perp DEXs. So I'm curious what you think about this.
Theoretically, it's possible, right? The way all those applications and aggregators work as of now, right, is that effectively you have to explicitly choose on which perp DEX you are trading, right? And you need to have a balance there. If we assume that, let's say you as a user, you already have balance on the multiple perp DEXs, right? Obviously, those aggregators, they can route the optimum both execution for you, right?
Yeah.
Because basically they just need to compare the fees, right? The order book depth and estimate the slippage, and they can calculate the most effective way for you to execute a given trade, right? If you don't have a balance across multiple perp DEXs when you start, right, it becomes a much more complex problem, right? And essentially the problem boils down to collateral management, right? So if there is a bridging solution that allows you to move funds across the perp DEXs seamlessly, right, then this all becomes possible. Given that there is no such a solution as of now, right, I don't think anyone will be implementing it right away, right?
Yeah.
Just because the collateral management system becomes too complex, as well as you've correctly mentioned that the trust assumptions and the security of the perp DEX is very different.
Yeah. I think also that, well, I haven't thought about this too much, so maybe I should think about this more, but it's also like a two-sided thing whereby not only opening the position, but closing the position eventually.
Closing
that's
and
another
then the
thing,
margin
right?
management, yes.
Yeah. So like maybe like some, very low liquidity perp DEX randomly quotes me the best execution on an entry, but then when I'm trying to get out, right, there's like nothing on the order book. And I think you would definitely want to know what you're getting yourself into, right, when you do that. And there does seem to be, like, I think this is some evidence of a clearer moat around perp DEXs specifically, right? Like there is something, because the derivatives live on a certain DEX, because there's two sides of every market, of every position. It is quite different than spot, right? Like when I route through Llama Swap or whatever, like when I end up going to sell whatever that spot asset was, like I have the optionality of 100,000 different places, right? So like that does make a big difference, I think.
In the nutshell, right, like I think theoretically it is possible, but it won't be happening, right?
Yeah.
Just because,
and also there's not much incentive for at least DEXs themselves to work on this, right?
Yes, unless you are sure that your cost of execution will always be cheaper than the others.
Right. Yeah.
But if you know that your cost of execution is not cheaper than the others, then there is no incentive.
Okay. Let's move to one of your more recent announcements. You're going to have to explain this to me. I tried to read about it prior. It's a little bit complex, so maybe you can help elucidate these vault systems. So the idea is yield-bearing collateral. That's one aspect of it. But like, give me an overview of this, like most recent product launch.
Yes. Look, in the nutshell, for the users, it's very simple, right? You can deposit the funds into the vault. The vault earns certain APR. And you can use those same funds as the collateral to trade perps, right? So the product itself, and
one quick clarification: when you say vault, this is like the same as HLP or LLP. Is that like okay?
Yes.
So it's the
HLP
extended
and
vault.
LLP are quite different, but yes.
Yeah.
Right.
Okay.
It's basically an extended vault. You can deposit funds into the vault, and then you will be able to use 90% of the value of your vault shares as the collateral on the exchange, right? And that collateral will be yield bearing. There will be two types of yield for the users. There will be the base yield, and the base yield is the current yield of the vault, right? And basically, it comes from two main sources. One is the trading activity of the vault, and second is all the liquidation flow. Because on every liquidation, the vault earns up to 1% of the earns up to 1% fee, right? And that what essentially forms the existing yield of the vault, and we call it the base yield, right? Then there will be an extra yield. The extra yield will depend on the user activity, right? So the more active you are as the user on the exchange, the higher will be your extra yield, and hence the higher will be your total yields, right? We'll be launching the extra yield, I think, next week, right? Or in a couple of weeks. But as for the base yield, it is already available for the users, right? So the product itself, from the user standpoint, is pretty simple, and the value proposition as well.
In its most simple form, I could deposit stable coins and not use it as collateral, but I could just earn the yield, right? So it'd be
Yes.
functionally similar to depositing into any of these other kind of perp DEX vaults.
Yes.
Um, okay, I would need to think about this more, but explain to me sort of so it sounds like from the outside that there's maybe some embedded risk. And I think maybe you're kind of, you can explain why you think that this is quite safe, and I'll give you the opportunity to do that. But, if like I'm hearing about this for the first time, like, okay, wait, so you can, it's feels a bit like a form of rehypothecation whereby, you can deposit and then this is supposed to be sort of like the liquidation, like, vault over here. And then you can also borrow against that. It's like, well, hang on now. So explain to me like sort of how you've designed this and yeah, maybe like the trust assumptions and yeah, then why you think this is safe.
Essentially, there are a couple of things which we need to consider, right? The first thing is related to the liquidation of the vault shares, right? So we assume that the vault is healthy in itself, right? And then the user who uses vault shares as a collateral becomes liquidatable. And then the second scenario is we need to consider various attacks on the vault. What if the vault starts losing money, right? Vault shares start depreciating in value, which leads to the liquidations of users, right? Now, if we start from the first topic, right? So the liquidations of the users with the healthy vault. Effectively, the way the liquidation process works is quite simple. If you have the vault shares balance on your account, the vault shares will be liquidated as the first step of any liquidation process, right? The way they are liquidated is basically a withdrawal from the vault, right? So if you have 100 shares which are worth $1,000, right? The liquidation of the vault shares just means that you effectively give back your vault shares and you get your deposit from the vault back.
Got it.
If that's successful, then we proceed with the regular liquidation process. Now, the biggest nuance there is that imagine the vault itself has open positions, right? And then when you have a user who is being liquidated, you need to withdraw the shares from the vault, which means that the vault needs to close the proportion of its open position, right? To fulfill that withdrawal/liquidation request. The edge case which can be there is that, let's say the vault has an open position on the market where there is no liquidity at a given point in time. So it cannot close its own exposure, hence it cannot service the user, right? In order to and hence like the user cannot be liquidated. In order to solve that problem, we introduced the new type of operation, which is available only to the vault, and that operation is called force close, right? So basically, if the vault cannot close its open exposure on the market via the order book, it's going to close its position, right, at the mark price against the most profitable and highly leveraged user. So this mechanics is similar to ADL in the sense that you are closing the position, but the difference between this approach, the force close, and the ADL is that with force close, you're closing the position at the mark price. So effectively, the user against whom you force close the position doesn't bear any direct losses, right? And in ADL, you effectively take the profits from the counterparty, right, and redirect it to the unhealthy user, right? Essentially, now given that we have the force close mechanics, the vault can always close its exposure, right?
Okay, how do you feel? Okay, just zooming out for a second. How do you feel about, well, not feel, like what do you think about the way these vaults work in general? And the reason I ask is because on 1010, right, we saw a lot of interesting things, specifically around perp DEXs. One of the interesting things that's now come back up into conversation was HLP ADL'd and ended up making a lot of money, and then the LLP on lighter, I think, ended up losing a lot of money. The way these things are designed, it's very important when these kind of events happen. I'm reluctant to call them black swans because they do seem to happen like once a month, right? But when these type of events happen, it's very important how they're designed, and that really like makes a big impact on the users and just the system as a whole. How do you like what do you view as like kind of like the optimal? So you've now talked about this like tokenized aspect of your vault shares, but like just zoom out for a second. How do you feel about like the best design for these vaults, and like maybe going forward, like what these look like? Are they the most sustainable model, or do we just kind of scratch this and have exclusively market makers, like, you know, on a centralized exchange or something? Like, where do we kind of end up with this this design?
Essentially, the answer to that is as follows, right? One is I don't really know the details, right, of how
I don't either.
Hyperliquid Vault behaves in regards to the APLs, right? Yes, we know the Hyperliquid Vault made a bunch of money during 1010, right? But I don't know whether it actually comes from the ADLs or whether it just comes from the liquidation fees which it earns, right? Now, I can only tell you how the extended vault is designed. We've also made some money on the vault made some money on the 1010, right? But none of the money which the vault made comes from the ATL, right?
Okay.
All the profit comes just from the pure liquidation fees, because effectively liquidation happens, the vault takes over the position, it closes on the market, and then takes a liquidation fee, right? So I cannot comment on the Hyperliquid case. But honestly, I don't think, personally, I wouldn't expect the profit of the HLP vault on the 1010 to come from the ADLs. I think it came from the liquidations, right? Because effectively the way the ADLs work, both in our example and in the example of Hyperliquid, is as follows. Imagine you have an unhealthy user, right, whom you cannot liquidate. You cannot liquidate him because there is no liquidity in the order books.
Yeah.
Essentially, the ADL comes in as the fallback scenario. And as part of the ADL, effectively, you pick a counterparty which has the biggest profit and the highest leverage, right? That is a relatively standard mechanics, right? So essentially, in the mechanics which I've described, right, there is no way for the vault to make money on that, right? And I do think that this is the way they've also implemented it, but I don't really know, right? But I can tell you with confidence that, at least in the example of extended, right, there is no way for the vault to make money on the ADLs, because effectively ADL happens between two users, one who is losing money and the other one, right? That's pretty much it. Super simple. As for the ADL mechanics in general, right, effectively there has to be a way for an exchange to close its bad debt, right? Because various events can happen, right, are not always dependent on the exchange itself, right? But there has to be a way for the exchange to close its bad debt. I can think of two ways how to do it, right? One is you close that bad debt against the user who made most of the profits, right? You can call it the tax on the reach, right? And the other option is you just socialize those losses across everyone, right?
Right.
I think it can be a very long debate on which model is better, right?
Yeah, I think it definitely is. Well, it seems to be like it's kind of cropped back up as a topic. I think Tarun wrote this paper recently, and now it's a big debate as to like how ADL works. And it is quite interesting. Okay, let's talk a little bit more about like what. So, are you guys offering spot already, or is that in sort of the roadmap?
We are not yet offering spot, but we essentially, our roadmap looks as follows, right? Until the end of the year, we'll fully roll out everything related to the vault, extra yield, increased contribution of the vault shares to the user equity, etc., etc. Then in Q1, we'll focus on the cross-asset collateral, so that besides USDC and vault shares, you will be able to use WBTC, WRAP-TIF, potentially USD, and other assets as the collateral on the exchange. Right.
Oh, that's interesting. Sorry. Can I ask you quickly about that? Yeah. So I've actually been, so again, not a pro user here, but I do mess around with these things. I've asked a bunch of my friends who are more on the pro user side or builder side, why we don't have cross asset collateral yet, like on hardly anywhere apart from centralized exchanges. Is it just that the like risk model is way more complicated, or like why haven't we seen this? I would love to be able to margin against Bitcoin. Are you guys are you one of the only DEXs doing this right now? I think maybe I haven't.
Honestly, I know like, look, my thesis here is that in the longer run, every single Perp DEX will have it cross-asset collateral unified margin, right? Now, I'm sure that the others are also working in that direction, right? But I do think that we'll be able to release it among the first ones, just because we already support the non-stable coin asset, which is vault share, right? So we already have the majority of the infrastructure required to support cross-asset collateral, right? To do it in Q1, right? I think the reason why first of all, I think Drift has it, right? And Vertex in the past also had the cross-asset collateral margin, right? As for the other perp DEXs, I would say the major complexity is not even the logic itself, right? But imagine if you have users who have WBTC as the collateral, but you are still settling all the PNL in USDC, you need to have a way to liquidate WBTC in case that user becomes liquidatable. So you need to have access to a very liquid market, a very liquid spot market, right? And then again, right, you have a problem that you cannot access liquidity on the other chains because liquidations have to be instant, right? So it's not fully interoperable. The way we are going to solve it is that we'll have an embedded RFQ system, right? So essentially, we'll have the cross-asset collateral margin without our own spot markets, and we'll be liquidating spot via an RFQ system, right? So essentially, if you have a user who has a non-stable coin as a collateral and he becomes liquidatable, effectively we're submitting the request for quote for all the market makers who participate in the program, right? And we tell them, okay, this is the lowest price at which we are ready to sell that one BTC, right? Who is ready to offer a better price? And we sell it off that way. And then in case you still are not able to sell that asset, right? You need to have some sort of ADL of borrows, right? So you need to be able to take off one Bitcoin from that user, redistribute it to all the lenders on the platform, and take USDC from them.
Got it.
So it is a reasonably complex system, right? But definitely can be introduced. Obviously, for various perp DEXs, they will have their own limitations, right? And they will have their own complexities, right? From our standpoint, I mean, we are quite confident we'll release in Q1.
Yeah, interesting. Okay, sorry, I interrupted you. You were talking about that was one aspect of Q1, so you can carry on with the roadmap.
Yes. So by the end of the Q1, we'll have the cross-asset collateral margin, right? In Q2, we'll launch spot, right? In reality, launching spot for us is relatively simple. The major complexity with the spot comes with the liquidity, right? Because on the perp DEX, it is much easier to attract liquidity. On the spot markets, it's much more complex, right? This liquidity is non-leveraged, etc., right? So we'll have it in Q2. Then in Q3 and Q4, we'll focus on the decentralization of the operator, right? So currently we settle on chain, but most of the trading logic, so order matching, etc., is centralized, right? And we're going to decentralize the operator among the validators.
What does that look like in practice? So Extended has its own actual validator set. Is that the idea?
Mm-hmm. Yes.
Okay. Why do you think this is important out of curiosity?
Yes, a couple of things, right? One, theoretically, it improves the resilience of the exchange, right? And secondly, you have a very natural and native economics for the token, right? So you have the validators; they are effectively doing the job of running the exchange, right? And then they get all the benefits and all the revenue flows of that exchange.
Will there be a fixed set of validators, I assume?
That's not something we have yet defined, right? Because this is a bit too early, right?
Interesting. Yeah. Where do you see, just again, kind of zooming out, like where do you see perp DEXs having, in your opinion, like a real competitive advantage? Is it these type of, interesting sort of primitives like the tokenized vault shares that could be used as collateral? Like, is it, a decentralized operator set? Like, we're obviously this is the kind of prevailing narrative right now, and it's because, like you said, it's one of the very obvious product market fits in crypto, right? It's like sort of undeniable at this point. But there's a ton of perp DEXs right now. Like, where do you see the real kind of I kind of touched on this before, but like, where do you see maybe Extended standing out, and then also just other perp DEXs, like where they fit in? And is this kind of like winner take all, or you said there's at least room for two? Like, how do you see this landscape maybe in the next 5 years or so?
Look, I think that in the next 5 years, the market structure of the perp DEXs will be relatively similar to what we see in CeFi, where there are at least 5 to 7 large players who have a significant market share, right? That's one.
Yeah.
Secondly, I do think that in the longer run, obviously, in order to succeed on the market, you have to innovate, right? And perps are a very complex product to innovate just because the nature of the product is relatively simple, right? So if you think about it, on perps, you have 4 or 5 dimensions across which you can innovate. The first one is the markets that you trade. The innovation there can be easily replicated by anyone else, right? The second one is the ways you attract liquidity. Like Hyperliquid was the first order book based DEX to offer the vault, right? Then you have collateral. On collateral, we are trying to innovate with the XPS, which is our vault shares. Then you have the fee structure, where you have Lighter, was the first exchange to come with the 0 fees. And then probably you have ways of trading and all the UI related stuff. And again, like Hyperliquid was the first one to launch the Builder's Code in the shape that we know now, right? And obviously, every player in the long run has to bring something on the table, right, to succeed. Like we are effectively working towards optimizing the margin, towards effectively offering new types of collateral. That's our path. It doesn't mean that others will not follow, will not do similar things, right? But that's the focus we've chosen.
How do you feel about assets, like a variety of assets? Obviously, we're seeing equities come in, like a lot of perp DEXs are now offering, derivatives of equities, commodities, Forex. Is this a big... where do you see this going? Like, is this like clearly the next step in terms of what people want to trade? Like, we've been trading all these governance tokens for 10 years. Like, are we finally ready to kind of start trading real things? And is this a way to innovate also as well, like bringing new assets onto DEXs?
Look, it is a way to innovate, but it's not really a competitive advantage, right? Because any perp DEX can replicate it very fast.
Yeah.
Right. So essentially, for any perp DEX out there, there are only 2 things which are required to launch a new market. One, you need to have someone to provide liquidity on that market, right? And second, you need to have the mark price, right?
Yeah.
That can be an external mark price, that can be your own mark price, whatever, right? But you need the mark price. So there are only 2 things essentially required for any perp DEX to launch any market. So that's why, like, the markets part, I don't see it as a real differentiator for anyone, right? But having the variety of markets and effectively bringing in TradFi markets, I think in the longer run is important.
I know this may be a little bit outside. I know you guys are still working on spot and it is probably quite some time off, but and this may be a little bit outside of the scope of extended for the time being, but what do you think about bridging spot assets onto, well, let's just call it a DEX now, right? Because once you have spot assets, like it kind of transcends the just strictly perp DEX. So you have this spot DEX. Like, how do you feel about the way that we bring, there's a lot of discussion about this. Should we be bringing like wrapped versions? Should we be trying to get people to issue directly? Should there be like, should Tesla and Amazon and Apple, should they be actually aware and, maybe directly issuing these assets in spot? Like, and the reason I ask is like, how different is this obviously than a lot of what we have now, which are derivatives, right? Like a mark price is much, much easier than either all the regulation and stuff you have to go through to actually bring an asset on chain. How do you see this kind of playing out in terms of the spot side of it?
Yes, look, I think given the simplicity of the perps will lead the way, right? So we'll first start having liquid markets on the perps, and only then the spot will come in, right? From the exchange perspective, once you have the spot assets, if there is a way to deposit that spot asset into your exchange, right, it doesn't really matter the way the asset has been issued, right? From the industry standpoint, right, the more support we have from the actual issuers of the underlying securities, the better, right?
Yeah, that makes sense. Well, I think we covered almost everything. This has been fantastic. Anything? Where can people find you? Obviously, Twitter. Feel free to talk about extended anymore. Get people to check it out.
Yeah, look, I think we've covered a lot of the interesting topic, and they really enjoyed the conversation. Right. As for the listeners, yes, please check out extended. Let us know your feedback. We're always super receptive to it. Right. And, thanks a lot.
And what's your Twitter handle?
So the Twitter handle of extended is extended app, right?
Okay.
that's the best one to follow.
Okay. All right. Well, I'll also link your personal one in there. So, all right. Well, thank you so much. It's fantastic. I appreciate it.
Thanks a lot.